So good morning. Yesterday we began to think about the power of the story that we are going to retell and relive at some level during Holy Week. And I'd like to go a little further this morning and think about the way in which, in the telling of the story and our listening to it, we are coming to understand the very nature of the human and understanding ourselves. In any good story, there are interesting characters. And an interesting character is a character we take seriously. You know, even if it's a soap opera or a movie or a TV series, it holds our attention for the duration of the story if the characters are convincing, if we in some way identify with them. They give us an illusion that they are real people. And great characters in literature, you know, characters like Falstaff in Shakespeare, who seems larger than life, larger than any of the other characters, or Anna Karenina in Tolstoy's novel. These are characters that we feel engage us and engage our minds, but also our feelings so deeply that we know them. Of course, they are inventions. They only live within the TV show or the novel or the play. But they are very deep characters, or they touch something deep within ourselves through the illusion of their reality. And that's how art works, of course. It uses illusion to take us into a deeper experience of reality. Even in the Matrix, you notice when the Matrix films were at their most popular, you saw everywhere there were men about the age of Neil, wearing these long dark cloaks and looking cool and mysterious and Matrix-like. So we're very deeply influenced and touched by the fictions that we create or we pay other people to create for us. And whenever we engage with a story like this, it's our own identity that is being touched. It's our own identity that's being questioned. Now, in one sense, we're given a break from ourselves. That's why we turn on the TV or we read an absorbing novel, or we say, it's a really good book, I couldn't put it down, it just totally held my attention, or it's also addictive as an escape from my normal world and my normal problems and my normal struggle with my identity. So in American TV series now, they have these long series with 20 or 30 episodes, and I was talking to someone in the States recently who said that her recreation at night is to watch maybe 6 or 7 of these programs, one after the other, just totally addictive, because each one, of course, ends on a very, cliff edge moment. So that's one aspect of how it works. It gives us a break from reality. Maybe not the highest art, but even the greatest art gives us a break from ourselves. And we always feel better. Just mind closing that door. We always feel better, thank you, when the attention does come off ourselves, because there's something quite tiring and limiting when the attention is always on ourselves. We're always thinking about ourselves, looking around us, checking whether we're happy or not, checking our environment, looking for things that either irritate us or please us. There's another sense, though, in which we approach the question of our identity, of our true self, in a new way by engaging with a story. We feel, in a really good story, we don't feel we've just been entertained. I don't think when you read the gospel stories, I don't think you feel you're being entertained. There is a feeling of being lifted up out of yourself. The attention is coming off your normal ego world, but you don't feel you're just being given a break. There's also the sense of engaging with a deeper level of your identity, who you really are. In Latin, the word persona, which gives us the word person, actually, of course, meant a mask. It was the mask that an actor wore in a play, and they would speak through this mask. So that's one sense of what it is to be a person. We are a role. We have a role to play in life. Our role might mean anything. It could mean husband, wife, father, mother. Those are important roles. You might also have the role of banker or bus driver or accountant, and those are also important roles, but perhaps they don't touch us so deeply, or shouldn't touch us so deeply as those other more intimate roles. But actually, I think we feel that there's no persona, there's no mask, there's no role that we play in life, however important it is, that can fully answer the question, who am I? And that perhaps lies behind those rather shocking words of Jesus that we have to sort of transcend, or he uses a very dramatic word, or it's translated as hate, because it doesn't mean hate, it means to be detached from mother, father, son and daughter, and friends, and we might add. It's not that these are not important or sacred connections or aspects of our identity or roles that we play, but it's that no particular mask, no particular role, and this doesn't mean we're fake. A mask is a way of communicating. The mask was actually a way of amplifying the voice on stage before the age of electronic amplification. So the mask is a way of communicating, it's not fake. But there's no mask, there's no persona, there's no role that can fully explain or comprehend our true identity. That's a little frightening, perhaps, especially if we invest ourselves completely and utterly in a particular role. And that pushes us back constantly to the question of who I am. And what happens if one day this mask is taken away by the death of a spouse, by children growing up and leaving home, or by your losing the job with which you identified yourself? These are profound losses which happen when a persona crumbles or cracks or just reaches its use-by date. So the question of identity is one that doesn't go away, and we can't cover it up. And a role, a mask, is not a way, actually, of covering up our fundamental question of who I am. Personality is another word that we today use to try to understand the mystery of the human, the mystery of ourselves. And a personality is probably close to what the persona means. Personality is the particular, unique, individual identity that we have formed in with our character traits, our quirkiness, our individuality. And in our culture, the cultivation of an image, of a public personality in a particular style, you see this in adolescence, they very particularly choose a style, a fashion, which sometimes only they and their peers can read, but through which they try to express their unique, their individuality, although very often it comes over as simply being part of a certain type or a certain fashion. So it all comes back to this fundamental question of who I am. And this fundamental question is not so easy to answer, either through a role, a persona, or our cultivation of a personality. And it comes down, of course, to this fundamental question of meaning. The question who I am is really the same as the question of what's it all for? What is the meaning of it all? In Monty Python's film The Meaning of Life, the humour is, and a sense of liberation even, it was found in making fun of the traditional ways in which we express meaning in our culture, especially religious ways. And or in The Life of Brian, for example, which was a way of making fun of the meaning of life that was expressed through the person of Jesus, or Christian faith or Christianity. And there's no doubt that there was humour, it's funny, but at the same time, after the laughter, what are you left with? There is a feeling of emptiness, of meaninglessness even, of being lost or being disconnected. In our culture, in which so many traditional ways of making meaning have collapsed, what are we left with? This question of who I am is not just an individual question, it's a cultural question, and one of spiritual significance for the whole of our society. So what are we left with as ways of making meaning and finding out who I am? Well, there is entertainment, of course. People speak a lot about entertainment, what they see on television, or comedians, or, I don't know, movies. There is surfing the web, which is a way of trying to travel the world and find infinite sources of knowledge and bite-sized wisdom, which we can do with a Google search. There's consumerism, that we identify ourselves with the things we aspire to own, the new gadgets, or the symbols of success or happiness or meaning that the advertising industry very powerfully create for us in our imagination, kind of the brainwashing of modern consumerism. There are package tours that we take to distant exotic places, thinking that we are explorers on the edge of the universe, but whereas in fact we're traveling within a very safe package. Or there's drugs, or there's pornography, or there's the medical pursuit of immortality. We spend a lot of our time worrying about how long we can extend our lives. So, there are many substitutes for the religious aspect, or the spiritual aspect even, of this search for meaning, this fundamental question of our identity and of who we are. But in none of these, we could add, you could add your own to this menu of the modern substitutes for meaning. But in none of them do we really, I think, or can we really, touch the experience of meaning, the experience of who I am. So not surprisingly, we are forced deeper into life. We either stay on the surface, exhausted by all these trivial pursuits and struggling with the addictions that we very easily acquire in any of these activities, consumerism or whatever. We either stay struggling at that surface level, or we are forced to go deeper. And I think for many of us, it is the spiritual search begins when we become bored, dissatisfied, frustrated, and experience the suffering of being stuck on the surface. And although we may have many attachments, we may have many reasons for staying on the surface because everybody else is there, or we think that everybody else is there because that's what the media tell us, we are in fact prepared even to undergo the pain of separation, of detachment, or the fear of being alone and separating from the crowd and the consumer mentality. We're prepared for that because it is simply so boring and so empty and so frightening when you think about it, to stay on the surface. Now, we're at a curious moment in the history of our civilization. We have produced material well-being on a massive scale, but we have lost in the process the symbolism, the religious context, which traditionally allowed us to make meaning of the basic questions of life, birth and death, for example. And that loss of meaning has produced deep levels of anxiety, of depression, of neurosis, and of addiction, which seem to increase with the level of our affluence, the diseases of affluence. So we find ourselves in this sort of contradictory world where we are trying to raise people, quite rightly of course, above poverty, the poverty line, and to give them the benefits of technology and economic development, knowing, of course, that in doing so we are also probably going to rob them, or they will voluntarily give up the deeper values and the deeper experiences of meaning that their culture has known. So we're in a bit of a existential confusion. What is economic growth all about anyway? 9 times out of 10, you turn on the news or the radio, it's economic news. This is how we make meaning. This is how we evaluate the condition of our world and of our society. It's through the figures and the politics of the figures of economics. And occasionally there are some ethical issues that get people worked up, but they're single issues rather unrelated to the bigger picture. So, as I say, we feel quite confused in our world, but what kind of world would it be if, from an early age, at a very formative stage of our development, we were able to live in the real world that we've created? You can't protect children totally from the world that we have created. Perhaps restrict the amount of time they spend online or using screens, but we can't overprotect them from the world that we've created. But what kind of world would it be if, from an early stage in life, even as they face these confusions and distractions and this overwhelming amount of substitutes for reality, that they were learning how to go deeper, or how to stay in touch and to sustain that inner journey through, for example, the practice of meditation, the most universal, the most simple, and the cheapest way anybody can imagine, that answers this fundamental question of meaning: who am I? So we don't know, really, what kind of society it would be. Probably a society with at a certain point, with a great deal of tension, a tension between all the vested interests in the industries of illusion and the substituting for reality, and the quest and the experience of authenticity that is present within the individuals. In any case, we can imagine what it might be like in the future, but this is where we are now, and not surprisingly, now we're forced to go deeper into life in order to find that experience of life, that experience of meaning that makes life livable. And this is where we rediscover death as a source of meaning. We can begin to rebuild our sense of meaning in life and our sense of who we are when we face death. And this is countercultural for us, because we are so used to a culture of the denial of death, where death is a failure in terms of medical science, or it's seen as an end to whatever meaning we have found in our life, because it just comes to an end. It sweeps away everything we have made, and everything we have learned to love, and everything by which we can identify ourselves. It's all stripped away by this fact of death. So, in a world where there are so few symbols and such a broken system of meaning, death has to be denied, it has to be suppressed. Of course, it comes out, in other ways, in our obsession with death and violence. We entertain ourselves by seeing people kill each other and torture each other. Hollywood thrives on violence and death. It's part of our entertainment. And that presumably is only because we have not been able to fit death into our broader, deeper meaning of life. So, surprisingly, or not surprisingly perhaps, it is in the speciality of palliative care, the care for the dying, that many people today find the spiritual dimension coming back into life. It's when they are able to face death, not just as a medical failure, or the meaningless end of the good things in my life, but to experience death as a part of life. And perhaps it is in the arts of palliative care, relieving suffering and helping people die, just as the midwife helps people to be born, that people find meaning, often much more so than through religious institutions. That's the reason for this is something so basic that like birth, death produces a feeling of compassion. Just as birth produces a sense of joy and hope, so death produces, or the suffering that we see somebody going through as they die, it evokes in the rest of us a basic compassion that we feel for the helpless, for hopeless suffering. And that compassion itself is redemptive. It gives us a new chance to live in a fuller and more joyful way. And this is a surprise and a paradox that is more and more public, really. The books that people write about their last days of life, you generally find, and most people caring for the dying in hospitals, hospices, would say the same thing, that the dying person, if they are basically well cared for, can and probably will say, I have never been happier. I'm facing the end of my life, I'm facing the greatest loss I can imagine, separation from the people I love most in the world, and yet I must say that I've never been happier. And the strange thing is that when a person has come to that point, you could say this is where they are really ready to die, because they have discovered the meaning of life, that when that person has come to that point, that happiness paradoxically, that happiness paradoxically is communicated to the other people around them. Even the people who are, especially the people closest to them, sitting on their deathbed, by their deathbed. They're feeling at the same time the greatest pain of separation and loss, and yet they are also feeling within that suffering the greatest joy and peace that they have ever found. And it's in that paradox that meaning is born. It's natural for us to want to look after the dying, just as it is natural for us to care for a newborn child. It's natural to want to relieve suffering if we can do so. But so that is basically what we might say is sympathy. We have that sympathetic response to another person's suffering. But there is also empathy, which is where we put that feeling into practice. So we're not just looking out of the window of the car at an accident and saying, "Oh, isn't that terrible? I feel sorry for the people in the car, in the crash." But we actually do what we can to make things better for the people suffering. And this soon brings us to realize the important difference between pain and suffering. I first, I think, became aware of this when I realized that people who are suffering chronic pain in intense physical pain can at the same time be joyful and selfless and loving people. It's astonishing. I could hardly imagine it. If I get a toothache, I forget about compassion. It's just my tooth is the only thing I'm thinking about. How we can live with chronic pain and yet remain open, be free from depression, self-pity. I mean, maybe everybody dips into it occasionally, but to be fundamentally free to love is astonishing, miraculous. And it can only be because the person suffering the chronic pain is in touch with a much deeper level of their identity, of their reality. And I think this is something important in our reading of the story of the Passion and the death of Jesus. Only the whole person can suffer. We suffer as a whole person. Pain is a part of us, maybe a very big part of us, or attract all our attention, but pain is located in a particular place. Suffering touches and involves the whole person. That's why the accounts of the Passion of Jesus, his torture, the abuse he underwent, do not dwell on the physical aspect. It was relatively late that the emphasis upon the physical suffering of Jesus became so intense in art, in the representations of the suffering Christ, or that film, The Passion of the Christ, where you have I didn't see it, I didn't want to see it, where you have apparently a scene of 20 minutes of Jesus being scourged at during his Passion. So the Gospels themselves don't give that much attention to the physical pain, although quite clearly there was a great deal of physical pain. But in a sense we become closer to the real suffering, to the real agony, in the phrase that we heard yesterday in the Gospel when it described the scene after he had been beaten. They made fun of him. They made fun of him. And it's in this humiliation, this abandonment by his friends, and his humiliation by his enemies, that we can sense that the whole person of Jesus was involved in this suffering. Suffering at its most intense shatters our dignity, our persona, our role. That's just completely swept away. Everything by which we identified ourselves and gave us a sense of importance, status, identity, it's all shattered. It deconstructs our personality, leaving a bare nothing, not even anything to say, who am I? That's why we and the Gospels spend so much time focusing on the suffering of Jesus, which is an incremental suffering, as we'll come to see. Because in the desolated, devastated figure of a broken, betrayed, humiliated person, we see something remarkable. We see that spark of divinity, of love, in the ashes of his humanity. Just as the dying man, having to let go, maybe in the prime of life, of his wife and children and family and his love of life, may at the same time say, I have found happiness. I have now understood the meaning and the joy of life. And I'm fully content to live in the moment that I'm in, however many more moments I have. It's the same paradox. You can find joy and fulfillment in the last stages of life, and in the passion and death of Jesus, this broken human being, we can see the fullness of being. And it's that spark within the ashes of the broken Jesus that we find the beginning of the flame that becomes the resurrection. Whatever suffering you or I have known, we can never speak for another person, is probably not as extreme as this. Victims of torture, innocent people who have been betrayed by the media, the sort of victims of the news of the world. Perhaps they are closer to the passion of Christ. It isn't that we haven't known suffering, but there are levels of suffering. We may or we may not realize that our suffering, at whatever level it is being worked out, and probably it is related to our capacity for it, we may not or may or may not realize, of course, how this is illuminated or connected to the story that we are living in Holy Week. Most of us are like the bystanders in Isaiah, or the crowd watching Jesus on the way of the cross. We look on, we feel pity, but we also secretly say, thank God it's them, not me. Even the suffering of the ego is not really comparable to this destruction of the whole person, or this deconstruction of the whole person that we see in the Passion story. The ego involves suffering, of course, automatically, because it's about separation. From a very young age, the personality, the persona, begins to separate, the ego begins to separate from the things it has identified with, the people with which it has identified until that moment. And wherever there is a separation, however natural and necessary it is, there will be pain attached to it, more or less. A great deal of the art of parenting is to minimize that pain while allowing the separation to happen. And in fact to absorb some of that pain on behalf of the child, provided the parents can do it and are strong enough to do it. So the ego involves inevitable suffering. While we're limited to this limited range of consciousness that the ego is, we will feel also incomplete, unhappy, and full of negative feelings from time to time, like envy, jealousy, anger, or pride. And these are not conditions, states of mind that make us feel happy or peaceful. And yet we often cling, we habitually cling to this unhappy condition because transcending the ego seems so difficult. It may seem impossible. It may seem just unrealistic or just sheerly frightening. Better the ego you know than the true self you don't. So I'll just stay as I am, and we remain within the level of suffering that is inevitable as long as we remain centered in the ego. Meditation becomes interesting, a source of hope, when we reach this point of egotism. When, if we want to expand beyond it into a bigger sense of self. When we are prepared to die in order that we may live. But simple as it is not easy to take the attention off our ego consciousness. It feels like dying, although it is only the first level of death. But it is a dying to self, or to self-consciousness, to the ego consciousness. It is a loss, a falling into something we cannot control or even understand. So it isn't surprising then that particularly in our consumer-driven society that cannot make meaning of suffering, that we have consumerized meditation. We've turned meditation into a kind of medication that gives temporary relief in some cases, which is a phrase in American advertising and the pharmaceutical industry. It gives temporary relief in some cases. So the full meaning of meditation can be very easily reduced to something that basically feeds the ego or minimizes the suffering of the ego. And it's a kind of relaxation of the ego and of the stress levels of the ego, rather than what it essentially is, and has been for millennia, understood to be a way of transcending the ego altogether. The secret of finding meaning is hidden in this acceptance of dying and of death, in this poverty of spirit, where we let go of everything without exception. It's what John Cassian calls the renunciation of all the riches of thought and imagination, a full letting go. This is what the mantra and the daily meditation allow us to do at a rate that we can cope with. That's why we can all be on the same journey of meditation, but we follow it at different rates. Sometimes we seem to go very fast, sometimes we give up, sometimes we slow down. So we rarely keep a steady pace. For example, the 2 meditations a day, every day. But when we do, when we can achieve that rhythm of the journey, we discover the rate at which we can cope with the process. It's surprising at first how many people, all of us, understand meditation perfectly clearly, but hold back from a full commitment to the practice. And we'll explore this. This is something we all experience. We'll explore this a little bit more this afternoon. In poverty of spirit, and we see what poverty of spirit means in the passion and death of Jesus, we find meaning as an experience, not an ideology, not an explanation of a riddle, not a scientific answer to a problem, but in the experience of connection. And we'll look more again at this later. In the care of the dying, it has become very clear that suffering can be dealt with and can be transcended only when the dying person feels connected. A person is a field of connections. We are either alive, and all our connections are alive, our relationships, or, and this is what happens in the last judgment, that the self-evaluation we call the last judgment, when we're facing death, we look at all the connections in our lives and we are judged by those connections. We're judged by those relationships, past and present. We're either alive in all of those connections, or we are like a dead or dying website where the links are dead. You press on a link and it doesn't take you anywhere. It doesn't respond. On the edge of existence, where we find the connection that makes us alive, it's here that meaning comes alive for us. And it comes to us with the sense of a gift, with a sense of something naturally emerging or manifesting, not as something that we have mastered or controlled. The shopping mall has very limited numbers of connections, the crowd of shoppers, the sales staff, but this is where a lot of people run to find in retail therapy some feeling of connection with others, in the crowd, with the sales staff, through their credit card. Football is about passionate connections. And there are other ways in which we can have these passionate connections with strangers. These are very powerful substitutes, but they're not sustainable. You can't live your life in a football match, although you can go to the back pages or the football pages of the paper and immerse yourself in that world. Religion can also give a sense of connection to other believers, to a community, but it can also fail to help us when we face the ultimate test of our identity, when deep or real tragedy strikes. So we'll come back and look a little more at this question of meaning and connection. But I think what I've been saying, I hope, suggests that it's in the work of meditation, in the practice of it, not in the study of it, but in the practice of it, that we can move towards and into that experience of connection that reignites or restores us to meaning. And it's why John Main says that when we meditate in Christian faith, we are entering into the dying and the rising of Christ. It's not just about relaxation. It's not just about temporary relief from suffering in some cases. It's not just about finding ourselves even. It's about entering into the mystery of being itself. Good. So let's take, we can just take a minute if you like to stand and stretch, or if you need to go to the restroom, then we'll come to meditate. Let's stay quietly as we prepare for the meditation.